Ever since the birth of governance, law, and ideology, people have pondered how to achieve the perfect society. Throughout history, most have shared similar ultimate goals: a world where justice reigns supreme, exploitation and suffering are minimized, and people live together peacefully without resorting to war or violence. In essence, that is what politics strives for, to create a system capable of realizing those ideals. While individuals and movements differ in their vision of what values or principles might bring such a world about, and often clash because of those differences, the underlying aim remains the same: to build a society that functions well and is regarded as good. Yet, the real conflict doesn't just concern what kind of ideals should guide society, but how they should be achieved. Two groups can share nearly identical worldviews and goals, yet still find themselves bitterly divided over the methods of bringing their ideology to power. These disputes over strategy, whether through reform, revolution, or some other means, often erupt into what we call political infighting. Even allies, united by principle, can fracture over questions of implementation. One side of the political spectrum particularly known for such divisions is the left. I even made a video over a year ago exploring why leftists so often struggle to get along. But the most prominent and enduring of these internal conflicts has occurred within the communist movement itself, especially over the question of how communism should be achieved. Should it come through violent revolution, as Marx and Engels envisioned, or through the ballot box and gradual reform? It was the German Marxist Edward Bernstein who first ignited this rift. Until his death, Bernstein remained a devoted Marxist and socialist, still believing in the ultimate goal: a cooperative, egalitarian society free from class exploitation. However, he broke with revolutionary Marxism and instead championed electoralism. He urged workers to engage directly with the political system, to work within it rather than seek to destroy it through violence. This stance became known as revisionist Marxism, and over time, it evolved into what we now recognize as social democracy. And to this day, the debate between reform and revolution continues to divide the left. If you followed Breadtube creators for any length of time, you've likely seen this tension play out, most notably in Vaush's ongoing feud with the so-called Tankies, whom he's gone so far as to call red fascists. The feeling is mutual. Tankies despise Vaush and his more reformist electoral approach to achieving communism. In this video, I'm taking a side. I'm forming an unholy alliance with the Tankies, because on this issue, I believe they're right. Communism cannot realistically be achieved through peaceful or democratic means. And to be clear, I'm not saying this in the boomer conservative, communism is violent and thus bad kind of way. What I mean is that, from an objective standpoint, if you actually examine the theory and the material class realities behind it, it becomes almost impossible to argue that communism could ever emerge through the ballot box alone. I've read the theory, I've studied it, and I came to that conclusion through reason and logic. So join me today as I put on my Tankie hat and play devil's advocate, tearing apart those filthy sockdems once and for all for betraying the proletariat. This is going to be fun. To stay fair to Marxism in this analysis and critique, I'll approach the topic strictly from a materialist and class struggle perspective, keeping idealism at bay as much as possible. While those of us on the right tend to downplay class divisions, seeking instead to unify different strata under a shared ideological banner, communism does not see things that way. Each class represents its own distinct ideology, with conflicting interests and expectations that are, more often than not, irreconcilable. That's the framework I'll be using here. The first and foremost crucial question is this: does the working class in any given nation make up more than half of the eligible voting population? If so, one could argue that communism might indeed be achieved democratically, since the working class would possess the greatest political power and could easily outvote all others. But in reality, we know that's not the case. Historically, by the early 1900s, the working class comprised only about 10 to 20% of the population in France and Germany, and perhaps 20 to 30% in the United Kingdom, the highest of the three, but still short of the 51% needed for a majority. And that's assuming every worker was class conscious, which they were not. And don't even get me started on the developing and industrializing nations. Given this, two paths remain. Pursue revolution to forcibly establish working class rule, since the proletariat is too small and fragmented to achieve it electorally, or attempt to do so through the ballot box anyway, despite lacking both numbers and full class consciousness. For most people, class struggle lies at the heart of socialist tactics. The Socialist Party thrives on conflict between social groups, and when necessary, it deepens those divisions. Its candidates appeal to workers and the poor, presenting themselves as champions of the oppressed and promising to right society's wrongs. The strategy isn't new. In ancient Greek city-states, demagogues called for punishing the rich, cancelling debts, and redistributing property. Aristotle noted that in democracies ruled by the masses, leaders would attack the rich and split the city into two sides. In some cities, rulers even swore oaths like, "I will always be the enemy of the rich and do all the harm I can to them." And just like then, reformists today stir resentment between classes, driving a wedge between the big bourgeoisie and the smaller middle class to win their cause. But there's a catch. Because reformists depend on the support of other classes, they inevitably compromise the interests of the proletariat, the very class they claim to represent. Their struggle ceases to be purely proletarian. Now it must also accommodate peasants, small business owners, and other groups whose interests don't always align. And in doing so, the integrity of the class struggle itself begins to fracture, sacrificed for the sake of broader appeal and electoral victory. French syndicalist thinker Georges Sorel wrote something particularly insightful about what happens in situations like this. When socialists turn toward electoral politics, the very definition of proletariat begins to expand, so much so that it ends up meaning anyone who feels oppressed. He writes, quote, "Their campaign messages are full of populist ideas. Socialism appeals to unhappy people without considering where they actually fit in the economy. Since our society is complicated and full of economic problems, unhappy people are found in every class. That's why you find socialists in surprising places. Parliamentary socialism adapts to whoever it's talking to: workers, small business owners, farmers. Even though Engels criticized it, they still try to reach farmers. Sometimes it's patriotic, other times it's against the army. This might seem contradictory, but election campaigns have shown that you can bring together very different groups, even if they usually wouldn't agree. After all, why can't a politician represent people from different financial backgrounds? Eventually, the word proletariat came to mean anyone who is oppressed, no matter their class. German socialists even got interested in the love life of the Princess of Coburg. One reformer, Henri Thoreau, who was once an editor of Petit Républicain and a city councillor in Paris, wrote a book about the proletariat of love, his term for prostitutes. If women ever get voting rights, he joked, someone will have to write up the political demands of this group. Yet, despite embracing electoralism, they still try to preserve a faint revolutionary spark. They love to make propaganda about the revolutions that came before, and idolize the brave revolutionaries that secured them their rights in the first place. And yet they also need to denounce violence at the same time. They use the memory of the revolution to inspire people, but at the same time, they trust in the system the revolution supposedly fought against. This contradiction weakens the very story they want to uphold. Once you remove the heroic battles from the revolution, what's left isn't very noble, just things like police crackdowns, political purges, and biased court trials. That's why reformists work so hard to show they are peaceful and kind-hearted. They want to look like gentle protectors who hate violence. They try to position themselves as defenders of the middle class against any working class uprising. To look more noble, they avoid all ties with anarchists. Sometimes they do this so harshly that it comes off as cowardly and fake. To the middle class, anything that gets rid of violence is seen as a good thing. All they want is to live quietly and die in peace, even if everything falls apart after they're gone. And consider again, they need to cater to the petite bourgeoisie. This is what I like to call the iron law of red decay, or as I sometimes say, Lenin's revenge. Any communist movement or party that chooses reform over revolution is destined, sooner or later, to decay into mere social democracy. The pursuit of broader electoral support forces them to appeal to other classes, and in doing so, they betray the very foundations of class struggle. What began as a movement for the proletariat gradually turns into a big tent ideology for anyone who feels oppressed. And so, inevitably, it becomes social democracy in all but name. That's why I consider figures like Vaush and Hasan Piker social democrats, regardless of how they brand themselves as commies or Marxists. In practice, they are nothing more than opportunists draped in red. So, we've established that communism cannot be achieved through democratic means. As long as parliaments remain under the influence and control of the bourgeoisie, nothing substantial can be done. The system absorbs any communist movement that embraces it and spits it back out as social democracy. But does this mean that communist revolutionaries should completely abstain from parliamentary politics, even knowing it's ultimately futile? Many early 20th century left communists thought so. They argued that revolutionaries should boycott bourgeois parliaments and elections entirely, dismissing them as obsolete, and instead devote themselves solely to revolutionary struggle. Vladimir Lenin, however, strongly opposed this stance. Lenin is a particularly fascinating figure in this debate. He fully recognized that bourgeois democracy was a facade, that genuine progress could never emerge from it. Yet he also rejected the idea of total abstention. At first glance, this seems contradictory. How can one believe that parliamentary participation achieves nothing and still advocate for participating in it? For Lenin, the answer was simple. Democratic participation was not an end in itself, but a means, a temporary tactical tool in service of a greater revolutionary goal. The core of Lenin's reasoning was mass influence. Even if communist militants themselves viewed and knew that parliamentary democracy was outdated, the broader working class still largely had faith in it. They firmly believed in the democratic process. As long as millions of workers are not only still in favor of parliamentarism in general, but are downright counter-revolutionary in their attachment to bourgeois parties and leaders, then it is obvious that parliamentarism is not yet politically obsolete. And a step towards class consciousness and turning workers into revolutionaries was making them recognize the reality that bourgeois democracy simply doesn't work. And you can't exactly achieve that by going to factories and giving speeches about how dumb democracy is. No, that will never work. You have to show the workers that it doesn't work, not just spew theory at them. As Lenin would write in his critique of the left communists in his pamphlet Left Communism and Infantile Disorder, quote, "Parliamentarism is of course politically obsolete to the communists in Germany, but, and this is the whole point, we must not regard what is obsolete to us as something obsolete to a class, to the masses. Here again we find that the lefts do not know how to reason, do not know how to act as the party of a class, as the party of the masses. You must not sink to the level of the masses, to the level of backward strata of the class. That is incontestable. You must tell them them the bitter truth. You are duty-bound to call their bourgeois democratic and parliamentary prejudices what they are, prejudices. But at the same time, you must soberly follow the actual state of the class consciousness and preparedness of the entire class, and all the working people. What Lenin is trying to say is, communists had to go where the people were, into elections, parliaments, and trade unions, in order to lead them forward. Participating in bourgeois elections and legislatures was not a betrayal of the revolution, but a necessary tactical means to win the masses. You shouldn't prop up the illusions of democracy and parliamentarism, but expose the rot from within, and then turn to the workers and say, as you can see, nothing here is working out. Only by revolution can you achieve your goals. This is the essence of Lenin's critique against the left communists. If you completely reject parliamentarism and stay on the sidelines, it would just leave the masses under reactionary influence, because they'd rather listen to those parliamentary parties compared to some schizo on 4chan screaming that democracy didn't work. Again, quoting Lenin here. Quote, "Even if only a fairly large minority of the industrial workers, and not millions and legions, follow the lead of the Catholic clergy, and a similar minority of rural workers follow the landowners and kulaks, it undoubtedly signifies that parliamentarism in Germany has not yet politically outlived itself, that participation in parliamentary elections and in the struggle on the parliamentary rostrum is obligatory on the party of the revolutionary proletariat, specifically for the purpose of educating the backward strata of its own class, and for the purpose of awakening and enlightening the undeveloped, downtrodden, and ignorant rural masses. Whilst you lack the strength to do away with bourgeois parliaments and every other type of reactionary institution, you must work within them, because it is there that you will still find workers who are duped by the priests and stultified by the conditions of rural life. Otherwise, you risk turning into nothing but windbags. But even if we agree with Lenin here, we run into the same problem as before. How exactly would the proletariat rule a nation after a revolution? Could they truly overthrow capitalism on their own, especially when they remain a minority among the classes? Communists were not blind to this dilemma. Even Marx recognized that the proletariat alone, even if fully class-conscious, could not sweep away the old order with their numbers alone. Some form of alliance was necessary, and naturally, attention turned to the largest and most numerous class of all, a class that, like the workers, suffered under exploitation and poverty. I am of course referring to the peasant farmers. Karl Marx saw the industrial proletariat as the principal revolutionary class, no arguments there, but he did consider the role of peasants in a socialist revolution, and he did not dismiss the idea of trying to win them over. After the 1848 revolutions, Marx and Engels urged their followers to support radical agrarian demands. For example, in 1850, they advised German revolutionaries to champion the abolition of feudal burdens and to push for an agrarian revolution to benefit the peasantry. Marx understood that to overthrow the existing order, the working class must address peasants' grievances, like land hunger and feudal oppression, so that peasants would not remain a reactionary mass, since on average they were the most conservative of the classes, right after the petite bourgeoisie. Now the question was, how could the class interests of the urban proletariat be reconciled with the class interests of the rural peasants? Well, the peasants wanted to escape exploitation and keep their land, and the proletarian-led revolution could abolish landlordism and provide peasants with collective ownership, thereby reconciling both classes' interests in a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. In general, Marx came to favor an alliance in which the working class would support the peasantry's emancipation, example from feudal rents, debts, and landlord domination, as part of the socialist revolution, while encouraging peasants to eventually join collective modern production. He maintained that a socialist revolution must ultimately socialize production, but he believed this could be achieved with the peasantry rather than against them, for example by transforming private smallholdings into cooperative farming, not by forcibly dispossessing poor peasants. So in theory, if the peasants and proletariat united and overthrew capitalism together, they could foster deeper class relationships that could pave the way for a peaceful transition to communism from socialism. The overthrow of capitalism may or may not be violent, but after that things should be smooth sailing, right? I mean, they both want to end their own exploitation. But the catch here is that, yes, the proletariat and peasantry could be united in revolution, but only on the proletariat's terms, that is, in a movement that abolishes private property and capitalism. The peasantry had to be led by the proletariat, rather than a proper united front. The reason was that Marx was still very skeptical about peasants, exactly due to their conservative, or as he calls it, reactionary attitudes, since they clung very hard to the idea of small private property they would own, their own land, and thus their own produce. So in his eyes, what had to be done was to quote-unquote proletarianize the peasantry and make them join the working class, otherwise things would just not work out. The Communist Manifesto is very clear about this. Quote, "The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are only so in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat." This alliance between the working class and the peasants can only work on the short term, at least until capitalism has been overthrown. But after that, the contradiction between proletarian socialist aims and peasant private interests would be so severe as to almost guarantee a conflict between the two. The proletariat, through its state, seeks rapid industrial growth, cheap food for urban workers, and collective ownership, whereas peasants generally want land, higher incomes for their produce, and a degree of independence in their work. So this can either lead to two things: provide the peasants with as many concessions as possible in order to keep the peace, but by giving them these concessions, you are effectively halting the transition to communism and just remaining in the socialist limbo. Or, good old coercion and crush the peasants with as much force as possible, guaranteeing proletarian dominance over the rural countryside, which is the path Stalinist Russia and Maoist China took. So if you ask me, the Worker-Peasant Alliance, while theoretically a cornerstone of revolutions in agrarian societies, harbors intrinsic contradictions that make it unsustainable in the long term. Peasants yearn for land and autonomy, essentially a bourgeois aspiration for property, whereas socialist regimes needed peasant cooperation in surrendering some of that autonomy for the collective good. When the balance tipped too far one way, conflict would always ensue. These class differences between the peasants and the proletariat can't be reconciled, and in order for communism to be achieved, the countryside had to be brought to heel under the urban boot, and most of the time, this ends with a massive spilling of blood. So, to finally answer the question, can communism ever be achieved peacefully and democratically? The answer is a resounding no. Once communists abandon revolution for reform, the path Bernstein took, they inevitably lose their proletarian focus. The movement expands into a broad coalition of all who can be considered oppressed, and its mission shifts to pleasing everyone at once. In the process, it dilutes itself into generic social democracy. Every goal of a proletarian dictatorship, and later a classless society, dies before it even begins. Revolutionary communists are therefore left with two options. They can attempt a purely proletarian uprising, imposing their will on the rest of society, a path that history shows would be extraordinarily bloody, and one even Marx, Engels, and Lenin deemed unrealistic. Or they can form an alliance with the peasantry, the largest class of all. With those numbers, a revolution might be less violent, the bourgeoisie might even surrender without a fight. Yet such an alliance comes with its own curse. The peasants would demand so many concessions that the communist transition would stall, or worse, a new class conflict would erupt between workers and peasants, once again ending in bloodshed. No matter how one looks at it, there is no peaceful or democratic route to communism. It ends in one way or another in violence. That's simply the reality, even in theory. For that reason, I have more respect for these so-called Tankies. They at least have the honesty to look you in the eye and admit that communism cannot be realized without blood. Meanwhile, the democratic socialists and reformist communists insist with almost religious fervor that a peaceful path to a stateless, classless cooperative society is possible and must be pursued. These people are either naive or opportunists, feeding off the communist movement while gutting it of its revolutionary spirit. In the end, they are humbled by the very figures they claim to revere. Anyway, that will be all for today, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks to all the glorious people on Patreon who are supporting me in these endeavors. Special thanks to Mudkips Our Life and SOAV for their extremely generous and high pledges. That really helps me out a lot. Anyway, bye bye!